Thank you very much, and it's lovely to be back in this chamber. I have had cause this evening to be reflecting on an early occasion when I was here having the pleasure of debating with Edwina Currie. Now, I was reminded over dinner that not everyone necessarily in this room is of an age to know who Edwina Currie was or is. No, I'm not going to tell particular tales or gossip. I'm just going to say that if you think of a somewhat more polite and better educated Katie Hopkins, you're not terribly far off the course. But I have a general policy as the Green Party of, we always play the ball, not the man. I don't like to focus on personalities and individuals. I like to focus on the arguments. Although I do have to say that I was very deeply shocked this evening when I heard some of the biography of the first speaker for the opposition. Now, when I talk to groups of young people around the country, I talk a lot about what's wrong with our education system, about exams, about schools that are just exam factories in which pupils are shoved through exam after exam, about, of course, the horror of tuition fees, unpayable university tuition fees. But when I've only got a little bit of time to say what's wrong with our education system, as I have this evening, I really have two words that I use. And those words are, what's wrong with education? Michael Gove. So I'm very, very surprised to hear that anyone who's been exposed to our education system should be considering Michael Gove would be someone they'd really want to hear from. However, of course, coming to the second speaker of the opposition, I want to begin, first of all, by paying real, honest credit. He did invite the Dalai Lama, something that the current government has refused to do, and I would say let's absolutely say credit to him for that and recognise that that was something that the British government did right. However, he is, as perhaps befits the most senior speaker in the House this evening, he went back to Henry VIII. I'm afraid my memory doesn't go back that far. But what I can go back to, and I think in the light of the discussion about Cecil Rhodes, and I think particularly the last contribution we had from the floor, and a very good contribution it was too, focusing on Britain's long track record. If we go back and think about the track record of trade relations between China and Britain, we can actually go back to the middle of the last century, round about, I think, the time the room we're in now was built. Indeed, it might have even been partly funded by it. That was, of course, the opium trade. When Britain forced on China the amount of opium that's in one each year, that's equivalent to a whole decade's production of opium around the world now. So Britain has a shameful human rights record when you go through history. And that, I would say, is not some reason not to act now, but it's very much a reason to act now. We've got a shameful record, it's time we cleaned it up. And I would say, when we think about trade policy, and we think about foreign policy, the track record of supporting despotic regimes, of forcing human rights abuses on people around the world, we don't have to go back to the 19th century. We can, of course, go back to the dreadful Iraq and Afghan wars that have helped to create the chaos, the situation that we're living in now. Or indeed, if we come to the present, and I think one of the floor speakers too referred to the fact that we trade, indeed we sell massive quantities of arms to Saudi Arabia. Taking the policy that it's the money that counts has not worked out very well. Taking the policy that we can impose things on people, support dictators. Maybe most people in this room are too young to remember this, but there was a time when Colonel Gaddafi in Libya was our dictator, when Saddam Hussein was our friend and ally and dictator. And we cannot allow ourselves to continue with that utterly failed approach to the rest of the world, the refusal to acknowledge that abuse of human rights, anybody, anywhere in the world, is part of our responsibility. Now, I want to make it plain, and I think we've heard two wonderful speeches from our side, and particularly from Anastasia, about the level of human rights abuses in China. But just to remind you, because we've been going a little away from this, to go to a recent Amnesty International report that listed the groups among the people who were among the hundreds of thousands of human rights prisoners of conscience in China. There are activists for ethnic groups, pro-democracy activists, activists for religious rights, environmental activists, NGO workers, lawyers, teachers, writers, artists, and of course Ai Weiwei is just one of the names that comes to mind. And you might expect me to comment on, and I think we can't pass without comment, the situation in Tibet. Now, I used to be the editor of The Guardian Weekly. I've covered international news for many decades. And when we look back on history, one of the things that I remember very much is the way in which we saw very often monks, people in Tibet, committing self-immolations, burning themselves to death as a protest against human rights abuses. People in China are making the ultimate sacrifice. People in China every day are demanding those universal human rights that should be the entitlement of every single human being on this planet. We owe it to them. We owe it to ourselves from a moral point of view, a point that was very powerfully made from the floor. But we also, when we think about the reality of where we are now, supporting dictators, supporting human rights abuses, continuing to support regimes from Saudi Arabia to the old Saddam Hussein to all the rest of it, it hasn't delivered us a safe, secure, peaceful world. Morally speaking, it's the right thing to do to take active action to support human rights, to say that abuse of human rights has real consequences. That's morally the right thing to do, but it's also the right thing to do to make all of us more secure, safer, to create a better world for all of us. So it's not a self-sacrifice. It's actually a sensible decision to take. Now, I think there's one final point that I want to make before you consider which door you walk through over there. The topic tonight is the House would sacrifice trade with China in protest of human rights abuses. We're not saying cut off all trade. We're not saying stop all Chinese inward investment into Britain, although personally I'm quite happy to draw a line under that disastrous Hinkley C new nuclear project. We've had quite enough of that already. We can just leave that die quietly. But what we need is targeted, focused sanctions that focus on the worst abuses in the worst industries, that focus on the actions of the Chinese government and say, we're going to sanction this trade until you change. Now, I think one final point to make. The other side has been talking a lot about what they see as failed sanctions. Now, we can debate all the cases that they've presented, but I think one case they didn't mention, and that's sanctions against apartheid South Africa. Sanctions had an impact. Internal fights within South Africa, people fighting for human rights in South Africa, those were forces that worked together. Sanctions is an effective tool. It's a rightful tool that we must be using to support the brave human rights activists, the fighters for justice and freedom in China, and to support a better world for all of us. That's why I'd ask you to support our side. Thank you.